Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. Today we're going to talk about STATIK. STATIK is the systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban. I'm Dave Grant. Thanks for the pressure, Jose. So I did my Kanban training with Jose, so if I screw this up, it's his fault. Okay. I'm an independent Agile Coach. I work for DevOps Group in Cardiff. And this is my Twitter handle. On most of the slides, I put my handle and a couple of hashtags. If you want to feedback anything on the session, then please feel free to do so. I quite like an informal session. Questions from the audience help me cover over the cracks in my presentation, so it's really helpful to me. Okay, so. What is STATIK? So go back to the foundations of Kanban, really. And so Kanban was introduced as with an example of a working system, something at Microsoft and Corbis. But it kind of had, there's an open question in its early days about how you get started. So one of the first solution to that particular problem was introduced by Corey Ladas in 2008. Something called Scrum. Hands up if you've heard of Scrum. Yeah, good. So that obviously tells you how to make your system more Kanban-like from an existing Scrum process, but not everyone starts from Scrum. So in 2012, David Anderson at the Lean Software and Systems Conference introduced STATIK, which is now part of the KMP1 program from Lean Kanban University. Okay, and what I'm going to do today is just going to go over the different stages of that approach. Okay. So we're not going to talk about systems thinking particularly. The systems thinking is used in STATIK in that it kind of makes you aware of where you are in a larger system. So it kind of makes you think of yourself as service-oriented rather than someone who just takes orders and gets work done. Okay. So the I for this session is printed as implementing. And I just wanted to go over a few things about why it's important that we get that I right. So the correct acronym uses introducing. Often it's written as implementing, especially by me. But I think the important difference is if we should be, as facilitators running this kind of workshop, introducing people to Kanban as an alternative to their current system of work. So implementing is on a scale which ends with imposing, I think. So if you're not careful, you can be using this kind of workshop as a way of telling people you must be doing Kanban, rather than something which is a bit more agnostic. Okay, so you have to be very careful. Usually, I found when I've run these kind of workshops that you have to get an invitation from the team really to run it, or someone with who the team follows closely. If you get invited to run this workshop by someone who manages a team at arm's length, be wary, because you could be accidentally imposing a new way of working on the team. Okay, so STATIK consists of 7 different stages. We'll go through these individually, so don't worry too much about writing them down. The important thing to note that even this isn't an ordered list. It's a kind of exploratory approach. So you may find yourself kind of moving back and forth between different parts of it. Okay. So the exploratory nature of it is really well described in this video by Eben Halford and Tom Reynolds. So the slides will go around with the link references, but so they call the approach service archaeology. So they kind of maintain this an interest in how something works, and you have to be prepared to kind of dig around and uncover ways of working rather than walk people through a very deliberate process. So, first step, what is the purpose of the system that we work on? So in this presentation, we'll use system to describe any sort of work that a team does. So it might be, right, we see ourselves as a service team, as a product development team. All of these ways of working are part of a system. Okay, so just to clarify that language. Mike Burrows, who was speaking yesterday, I haven't seen him around today, I'm not sure if he's still here, but he describes in his book, Kanban from the Inside, as the purpose of the system is to meet someone's need. Kanban from the Inside reserves the third part of the book entirely to talking about static. So if this presentation piques your interest in this approach, then I strongly recommend that you read this book. Not just for that, but also for its great coverage of Kanban Method as a whole. So one of the things I've found with teams is that if you're working in this approach with some teams and their default position is to take orders and to do work rather than see themselves as a larger system, then they may not be fully aware of what their purpose is, i.e. where they sit in a larger system. And sometimes it can be difficult to get to that purpose early on. So some ways of approaching static will put purpose last. So you do all that exploratory activities, and then it becomes clearer to people what their purpose is. Okay, so be prepared to defer it or visit it more than once. So next step. Sources of dissatisfaction. So I mentioned earlier about the dangers of imposing static on a team that hasn't really welcomed it. Sources of dissatisfaction, if you're not careful, could be seen as a way of criticising the team as well, especially if they don't think there's anything wrong with the way they're working. Then you have to be quite careful how you phrase these questions. Okay. So in general, let's say you're working with a team who have invited you in and are curious about how they can improve their ways of working. One question might be, is your system fit for purpose? Okay, so looking at the purpose you've uncovered in the first step, can you meet that purpose very well? You know, if not, where are areas you might be able to improve? Within the team, what are you unhappy about? And so there's some examples. Is your work blocked frequently? Are you able to deliver? Are you able to process all the work that you're being asked to do? Do you get interrupted a lot? This is probably true for a lot of teams who aren't working in a structured system. Some will, if you don't have a queue of work, of incoming work, someone is likely to jump ahead and ask you to do things, which affects your ability to deliver work in progress. And then we move on to thinking outside the team. So trying to empathise with your customers, people downstream from your team. What do they not like about the way that you're currently delivering? So is your system predictable? If predictability is what they want from your system, do you have any service level agreements or objectives? Are they required? So if, for example, if a team upstream from you has an SLA, they presumably want an SLA from you to be able to validate what they're offering as well. Looking at where variability comes from. If your system isn't predictable, why not? What causes problems? Do you have skills silos, for example? Those kind of things. And what's your failure demand? So how frequently do we have to do rework on something that we previously thought met its need? Okay, are we doing 20% of the work we're doing rework? Where do those quality problems come from? So the next step, analysing demand and capacity. My approach to this generally is to iterate over the services the team offers. I was working with a team of DBAs, and we found that they had about 20 different services they offered. Some of them kind of tiny, you may get once every 3 months or so. Other things you expect to get requests every hour, but for this step and a couple of the following steps in the approach, it's better to work one service at a time. Okay, and when you're working through this, and I find the best approach to this part is just to have take a whiteboard, draw rows on the whiteboard, and then identify the service, and then just kind of work through it one by one. Okay, and we'll talk about steps in the workflow later, but it's generally a good idea to use actual examples of that work. So, have you got something you recently delivered, or something that you're working on right now? Otherwise, people tend to have a rose-tinted view of how good they are at delivering stuff. Right. So a way to start off, if the services aren't obvious, particularly if you haven't done anything in that area recently, look at who your customers are. They tend to be better known, I think, than the services you offer necessarily. And then what do they ask for? Okay. How does your work arrive? So it might be 5 items a day, 3 per week, or once a month. Very rarely. Is the arrival rate uniform? Is it very predictable? Does it appear random, or does it follow some other sort of distribution? Does it arrive in batches as well? And is the demand seasonal? So, for example, if one of the services you offer happens to be making Christmas cards, it's the best seasonal example I could think of. Then it's kind of good to understand that as well. So how does work leave? So once you've done the work, how does it leave? So I was playing the Get Kanban game this morning with a team, and the example from that game is that work is batched up and delivered every 3 days. So if you're working in a product development team, do you use continuous delivery? If not, how often does work get shipped out? And who receives that work? So this helps you explore the different systems that you're part of. So in Jose's talk yesterday, if you were in that, it showed kind of networks of different systems. So it's good to understand where you sit within that network. Okay. And I'll just talk a bit more about that. If your downstream service expects work in a particular way, that may well affect how you deliver yourself. So if they're not ready for your work, then you need to kind of represent that in your own system as well. Is your work delivered in batches, which we covered when we talked about CD briefly. So next thing is the knowledge discovery process. So this is sometimes referred to as a workflow, which is probably a bit more friendly, I think. But the reason we call it the knowledge discovery process is related to knowledge work. And so this is, I think, the domain that Kanban is most useful in. So there's a link at the bottom from someone called Alexei Zegloff. It's a series of 4 or 5 articles on understanding exactly what this means. In the graphic on the screen shows 4 different distinct stages, and these stages show when we understand more about the request that we're servicing. Okay, so when has knowledge increased? Those activities here, these are the dominant activities in this area. We don't want a team to be obsessed with updating the status on their board. if you're, I kind of fell into the trap of going, well, wouldn't it be great if we knew the cycle time for every single activity? But it means that someone could move a post-it on a board, and by the time they sat down, they have to go move it again, which isn't much fun. Who is involved in each activity? So do you have silos of specialists within your team? Does work ever leave the team? So, for example, if you have, if in your network of services the flow isn't linear, it kind of goes off to another team and then returns to you. And you see this in organisations where they have a speciality who are involved in delivering value for more than one value stream. They'll often be pulled out, centralised, and then people have to be customers of that team. And obviously that has an effect on flow, okay, because you're crossing streams with someone else. Because we do knowledge work focused on the knowledge, not on handoffs, it can be quite tempting to see handoffs as acquisition of knowledge, but that isn't always the case. So, for example, when you're doing a code review following someone's development work, you're still learning. It's kind of an iterative cycle. Okay, so model that as a single step instead. Okay, because you should generally not go backwards on a Kanban board for nothing else, and it will mess up your cumulative flow. But generally, you haven't acquired that knowledge until it leaves that step. Okay. And then finally, once you've analysed a whole bunch of services, is there a meta process governing multiple services? So I ran this session with a marketing, the first few steps of STATIK, not the whole.
Sorry.
Not the whole thing. And we found that with the marketing team, they did a lot of stuff which required acquiring knowledge and an editing process. And then a publishing process, which had different names, but the same meta process. Okay.
I'm out of control, sorry.
Right. So next stage is discovering classes of service. So who's familiar with the concept of classes of service? Oh, I expected you at the back to be familiar. Okay, so Kanban has a few default classes of service. So these are standard work items, so things that you deliver. This is your bread and butter, especially if you run a sandwich shop. Thanks. Thank you. Cheers. Expedite. So who was in Dan's talk yesterday? Okay, good. Half of you. So expedite is, all right, we need to get this stuff out the door. So this is usually the CEO's default class of service, also known as the JFDI class of service. Then next you have a fixed date, so something that needs to be done, maybe regulatory or statutory work. And then you finally have intangible work. Intangible work is things which are maybe improvements to your process, something to increase your capability, or maybe something which is long burning. So something like patching a database server, for example. It's low priority until there's an exploit in the wild. So you'll find that if you read more about this, you'll see certain urgency profiles for different classes of service, and intangible tends to be a very low level of urgency until things go wrong, and then it grows exponentially. So the question to ask is, what do customers expect from the system, and what's expected by their upstream customers? So what kind of level of, what kind of class of service do their customers require? And do you have to match that in order to help them meet it? Which you might not need to if your system is predictable enough. But don't just stick to the Kanban defaults. Don't offer them out of the box. Think about what your customers actually require. Okay, so I've skipped ahead one, but so Mike's advice is to design for a balanced system. And those of you who were in Dan's talk yesterday will recognise that too many expedites causes problems. He gave that talk at Lean Agile Scotland as well, so those of you who didn't see it, I urge you to kind of give it a go. So what level of certainty do your customers require? Generally, unless we make it explicit, certainty levels of 100% are generally assumed. Sometimes even when you tell people how certain you are. I just had to get that out there, sorry. It's more like therapy for me. So for example, is 85% confidence enough? And if so, we'll say, right, we can give most 85% of items we'll deliver in 10 days. Do they need greater confidence? Are they maybe offering an SLA to an external customer to which penalties are attached? Okay, so make sure you understand what level of certainty they yes?
You said that you weren't monitoring cycle time, so you're just using the CFD to come up with the estimations of time?
So if you're not doing that already, you mean?
Yeah, so did you say not to use cycle time?
I didn't say that, no.
Oh,
Okay. So I think you'd have to do that, I think. Yeah. So the next bit, also known as the fun bit. Okay. So for those of you who are waiting for the fun bit, this is it. It might not be as much fun as you think it is, but yeah. It's all relative, right? Okay. So these are the ways we want to work in the future. So the important thing is Kanban system design is not just about the board. The first Kanban system didn't use a board. So it's about how the system works as a whole. So these are things like whip limits on activities. So these are the columns. Services, personal workload. So if you want to use like an avatar or something to make sure that people don't pull too much work in. And an aside on that, if you're going to do avatars, watch out for people printing their own out. Okay, so you go, here's 2 avatars for you to stick on the board. Where did the other 40 come from? So you have to watch out for that. And also whip limits on classes of service. So for example, we allow one expedite item at a time, that kind of thing. Explicit policies, so pull policies, including replenishment. So Dan talked yesterday about pull policies and how they affect predictability of your system. SLAs, and when it's okay to exceed work in progress limits. So I tend to find the more you're explicit and the more you write how things work, the easier it is to experiment with those things. Okay, the more consistent your system behaves. System cadences, so how often are you going to do your stand-up? How often will you replenish your queues? How often are you going to deliver? How often are you going to look at how you deliver? So your service delivery review, and how often are you going to do a retrospective on these kind of things? So a couple of excellent books. You chose the right session, Andy. So a book called Practical Kanban by Klaus Leopold. It's an excellent introduction. My second favourite. Introduction, and we have Essential Kanban condensed. So it's about is it less than 100 pages?
Yeah, the method is 40 pages really, and then there's 40 pages of notes and appendices and glossary.
So it's a really easy read and a great thing to distribute, especially if someone's about to start a Kanban engagement. Just distribute this around. Because I think it's free if you submit your email address, I think. So next, visualization. So things like there's really no limit really to what you can do. So card colors, layout, your board columns, board swim lanes, use of avatars, etc., etc. A good book on this by Jimmy Janlin is 96 visualization examples it's on Lean Pub. That has absolute dozens of examples. The it's odd, I think, that the least interesting example is on the front cover.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I do that already. So, but there's loads more which are even better than that.
There's one in there which is an alternative kind of board where you have an hourglass shape
Mm.
to illustrate your whip limits. So you might get narrower at the, I don't know, code review phase or the testing phase. So you physically can't fit more in the solution, just turn things on the side.
I think it makes you think about, what is possible. You see these kind of examples and you think, oh, I feel kind of a bit rubbish now that my board's just a grid. Okay. And the last phase is to roll out. So this is where we tell everyone what we'd like to do and see what is acceptable to them. How we're going to engage with the rest of the system or the value streams that we're involved in. How often we're going to meet with our stakeholders to kind of go through this. So talk about service delivery review. If you're part of a wider system, you might have an operations review. In practice, it's not very. I haven't found that to be very common, but it's important to keep meeting with people. When you're rolling it out, just double check, have the external sources of dissatisfaction been addressed? You might not address them immediately. It might be a plan to address them in future. So, excuse me. So some practical guidelines. So I've run this workshops about 5 times now. Some of them been more successful than others, it's fair to say. Generally consider KMP1 training for more in-depth look at STATIK, also to read Kanban from the inside. We've got a couple of trainers in here. Also, if you're going down to Learning Connections stand as well, they can put you in touch with some people.
What does KMP stand for?
Kanban Management.
Probably the most important one is not to rush and stay curious about how it's. The worst effects I find is when you have a strict time box on this process. We're currently myself and a colleague are currently taking a quality team through STATIK, and the way that's working for us is having a 2-hour having blocks of 2-hour workshops and seeing if we need more, and having another 2-hour workshop. It's quite hard to interrupt teams for, say, 2 days at a time and say, look, let's just get it done. And also shorter workshops allow teams to kind of abort the process if they don't think it's helping them particularly. Okay, yeah. So if you do cut corners, if you shorten these activities in order to get them done, you can create problems which are then harder to fix. Okay. So one of the most important things for me was introducing the concepts with some nice games. So this one here is Get Kanban, for those of you with deep pockets. And there's also Feature Ban and Okaloa Flow Lab, which can be used to introduce the concepts. It makes it nice and it makes it quite good fun, especially if people aren't used to working that kind of way. So the team that I talked about, the quality team I just talked about, we ran them through Get Kanban, and they were extremely interested in how a Kanban system might behave. So it made it much easier. We didn't have to sell the idea of looking at a different system. They are actively asking us to introduce it. And don't assume that Kanban is the answer. So avoid imposing, remember to introduce. So where to go next? So there's a recent thing that was introduced, the Kanban maturity model, which has various levels of maturity for different practices. It's when we talk about avoiding imposition, we also have to talk about avoiding judgment as well. I think I think there's lots of potential in this model. I think it certainly makes things quite clear, but it does it just shows kind of one way of doing things, and it might not, people might not take that the right way. Alternatively, you have the Kanban guide. So there's these posters available. Don't make the mistake I did and print out double the size, because then you lose the benefits of these nicely sized squares which fit post-it notes rather well. So hat tip to Jose, and what was the name of the team?
It was me, JP, Bailey, Andy the
And where was it created?
team.
So this gives you, and correct me if I'm wrong on this. So the things you see in green here, which you can probably, there's probably better contrast on the paper here, are core practices, good ones to start with. So if you're not doing these, you might question whether or not it's a legitimate Kanban system. To the kind of, and the yellow ones are things which are you might want to try to increase your fitness for purpose. So right down the bottom right hand corner we have static and reverse static. So reverse static is when you have an existing system to revisit it in reverse order. So run through those steps in reverse order, make sure that everything is working well. It's kind of like a tune-up, I like to think of it, for your Kanban system.
You can download the ones in the learning connections activity.
What's that, sorry?
They are available.
Yeah, so all the posters downstairs, they've got a few of them left. Okay, so that's it. Well done, you made it through. There are no prizes, unfortunately.